So a little bit more back to the active engagement dimension. Our panel is going to be talking about CDR around the world and global perspectives. So I think if we can have the other panelists up on the screen. Okay. Wait a moment. Great, good. Excellent. So Asitava and Andrew, we can see you here in the room as well. So don't spill your coffee on your shirt or anything now. You're in view. So it's my great pleasure to chair this panel. We're going to spend about 45 minutes diving a little bit into what CDR looks like from the perspectives of places outside the UK, and then talk a little bit about how we might want to see collaboration globally on these issues. Earlier today, we touched upon issues related to policy, and some of those came down to issues of things like demand. And in the first session today, we spoke a little bit about what we understand of the science and the evidence and the technology. And all of these things, there's a lens you can shine onto an individual country, but also aspects to which they're really international. So we've got with us today Noah, Julia, Asitava, and Andrew. And geographically, those we cover then respectively the US, Germany, India, and Australia. And those people can also give us some insights into what's happening in those regions where they're based as well, which is hopefully can be great. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to spend 5 minutes right now telling us who they are, where they're based, and giving us a little bit of insight into what CDR looks like from the perspective of where they usually sit, not just to the left of me, but where they usually sit. And then we're going to dive into a bit of a conversation. So I'm going to start by asking Noah to introduce yourself and tell us about the US.
Well, thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Noah Deich. I know we have this post-lunch vibe in the room. You bring the U.S. guy to talk about what's going on in D.C. right now. I hope to spice things up a little bit. So that's where I sit. I sit in Washington, D.C. I served in the Biden administration, leading our carbon removal work for the past 3 years. I'm now back in civil society wearing a handful of academic and nonprofit hats. Previously, I co-founded Carbon 180, an organization that is working on carbon removal policy in the U.S. And it is crazy, I will acknowledge that, but it's actually interestingly nuanced in the United States right now, and maybe some good, bad, and ugly, if you will. The good, industry is still committed to carbon removal in many different dimensions. We both see startups out there actively building projects in the US, delivering carbon removal credits to suppliers, many of which are still purchasing ever-growing amounts of carbon removal credits. Interestingly, the reason that a lot of companies are buying carbon removal credits is because of this AI boom. The folks that have invested most heavily in net zero from a corporate voluntary perspective are the same companies that are increasing their emissions and their profits due to AI and so much of that tech compute and the associated finance around it. So I'm cautiously optimistic that that industry can be a bridge, albeit one that has a clear ceiling. We do not see a wave of fast followers coming quickly in the US. We don't see the broad understanding that removals need to happen now and need to happen at small and growing scale with high integrity, which is why government action is so important. I think when it comes to government in the US, we have both positive and negative signs. I think the most encouraging signs are actually at the state level. We see California recently passed significant legislation around carbon removal. Hopefully they will fund it in the not too distant future. But we see a lot of the states picking up some of the climate ambition that the federal government is dropping. It's not the entire federal government either. Congress still seems very committed to carbon removal. There's actually been increases to the tax credits for certain types of carbon removal. And so it's kind of odd that in this environment where they're just slashing all sorts of climate budgets and gutting the overall architecture of the climate legislation of the past couple years and really a few decades in the US, Carbon removal seems to be okay in that environment. Don't really know where that's going to lead us long term, but shows that it does have some bipartisan resilience in the face of otherwise catastrophic changes to climate policy in the US. The ugly is certainly the administration does not seem to care about anything climate related, and carbon removal is climate related. And so I think where folks are looking to adapt and really survive the next couple of years in the US is to figure out how to focus on pieces of the climate puzzle that are not going to be made exclusively a climate story, where its energy demand is growing in the United States. So how do we supply that energy demand? And how do you use tools that could potentially be carbon negative for that? How do you embed carbon removal into industrial processes that might be completely outside of where we think of traditional carbon removal policy, wastewater, mining, agriculture, those types of industries? And so I think it's really that framing about how do you locate carbon removal policy where carbon removal isn't necessarily even the primary objective, it's the co-benefit of some other outcome. That to me is where the conversation is headed, at least in the near term in the US. An admittedly more challenging one, but one that's not impossible to make the progress that the field needs to in the next couple of years.
Okay, brilliant, perfect. Nicely on time and clear-headed, but also a bit of a positive sight ahead. Okay,
Can't
great.
help myself.
Good, great. We're going to go now to you, Andrew, in Australia. So you're up on the screen, you're pretty large, and we should be able to hear you clearly. So please give us a perspective from a bit further away.
Absolutely, from the Antipodes. I'm actually based in Hobart in Tasmania, so about as far from you as I can get at the moment. And I lead a program in Australia called CarbonLock on developing novel CDR, and I'm with CSIRO, the National Science Agency. Thanks for the chance to talk. I guess we have quite a different position coming off NOAA there from Australia. We've just released our net zero plan, what we're going to need to do to get to net zero in Australia. And we've come up with a number of 150 megatons of removals to get done by 2050. Important to note, of course, that for Australia, that's not going to stop our warming. We're going to need to go net negative, and that's part of the conversation as well. The question is, how is Australia going to get there? Well, the short answer is we're going to need a lot more conventional nature-based solutions, and we're going to need to be developing novel at scale, and that's increasingly recognised by our governments, both at the state and the federal levels. Of course, conventional and nature-based has a long history in Australia, lots of co-benefits, but also facing a lot of uphill challenges. Australia is a nation often in the news for our climate variability and climate change, and we know that our land sector is going to face competition going forward. So there's a huge need to develop novel CDR in Australia, and also we note that it's going to take an increasingly important role from now. We have very little, but we're going to need to accelerate and bring that forward to get to that net negative piece. We also think Australia is really well positioned. Certainly in terms of our renewable capacity, it's a huge opportunity and natural resources in that space. And we see probably opportunities right across all parts of novel CDR in Australia. Obviously, peatlands and others are not part of what we have really in Australia, but certainly for most of the others, we certainly think we have quite a lot of capacity here. And for us, ocean alkalinity enhancement is one that we're thinking about as well. The challenge is, how do you realise these at scale? Always a challenge at a meaningful scale. Before COP, we intend to release Australia's first national CDR roadmap that really outlines how do we go, what's it going to cost to do CDR at scale, what's our capacity to do that, and ultimately how we're going to get the costs down in a way that we have that when we're ready to use that. And that's had support right across Australia, but nonetheless, we do still hit headwinds all the way through with things like not having bipartisan support for net zero, things that Noah has touched on briefly. There still remain challenges, despite the fact that there is an agreement to do this. There's still challenges ahead. I would say also in Australia, CDR is not mature in a way to talk about. We're not having a national dialogue. We're not having regional dialogues. That's going to be a huge challenge for us going through. Still a lot of confusion there. So that's a really big challenge for us as a nation to bring our maturity levels up to be able to have these dialogues. Nonetheless, we do see broad support right from cities and across regions, which is brilliant. We see quite equal support across those, and we particularly see strong interest among young Australians. This is a message that resonates with younger Australians, and certainly in the research space, we're seeing a lot of new folks coming into this area. Australia is a big country. We need to increase engagement and regions. And I'll tell you what, we've done not a great job in Australia, first to say it, First Nations engagement. We have not engaged well with our First Nations, and that's a really important part of what we need to do. A couple more thoughts here. We are thinking towards, we have always worked internationally. It's a really important path for policy and research. We're engaged heavily through things like mission innovation, which the UK is involved in. We see that a massively important forum, especially driving through that valley of death that CDR industry is really experiencing at the moment, certainly through the IPCC and through bilaterals, through the whole assessment process. We see that really important. We're trying to ramp up our engagement regionally, certainly, and we're asking the question, do we need an Asia Pacific CDR network? We're starting to explore what's a meaningful engagement look like, especially with the Global South, an incredibly important question, but it's quite diverse. It's such a mix of Global South and North in our region. And probably for us, the big challenge is how do we engage with the Pacific? Such an important part for our brothers and sisters here. I guess finally, from an Australian perspective, if we get COP31 next year, that'll be amazing. And it's a huge and excellent opportunity to raise the profile of CDR in Australia and our region. And for us, that's something that we'll see more coming out of Australia. And that's something we would like to really amplify and resonate and try and build some more meaningful action towards that off our roadmap, but also towards taking others with us, because it's something we're all invested in, of course. And with that, thanks.
Okay, brilliant, perfect. Again, gold star for timing, but also really, really interesting to hear quite different political context in Australia than we have in the US at the moment. But of course, you've been not without your ups and downs in Australia either on commitment to this issue, but interesting to hear where everything stands now. And I'll pick up on some of those points that you made a little bit later on. So thanks, Andrew. I'm gonna come back over to Europe and let's hear from Julia about the German perspective.
Good, thanks very much. So I'm Julia Pongratz. I'm a professor for physical geography and land use systems at the University of Munich, but I'm an Earth system modeler by background. But I'm also advising the German government on nature-based solutions. I'm here foremost because I'm the spokesperson of CDR Terra. That's kind of the equivalent to the UK GGR program. But in Germany, and my appreciation for GGR, you can see that I'm sitting here missing a day of Oktoberfest at home. Good, so what to say about Germany and of course the EU context. So we know there's no next NDC submitted by the EU. The European Science Advisory Board on Climate Change recommends ambitious targets. It calls for split targets of emission reduction and CDR, both to be fulfilled in the EU. Germany, with the new government and their coalition treaty, would support fairly ambitious climate targets, but only if international credits up to 3% would be allowed. So Germany clearly is interested, therefore, in what happens internationally, and it could indeed be expedient to support permanent CDR for technologies that don't scale in the EU. But of course, that's a discussion yet to come. Germany has been serious to push forward sustainable pathways for CDR. In the last year, so there has been a long-term strategy on negative emissions developed with a big stakeholder consultation. In Germany, it's ready, but it's unclear if and when it will be published. Something similar can be said about the carbon management strategy, which is, for example, considers CCS, of course, then also relevant for CDR. However, the proposed amendment to the Carbon Dioxide Storage and Transport Act, this would allow CCS on German marine territory and also with opt-in options to do that territorially. So that's clearly would be a step forward in implementing CDR of diverse options in Germany. Currently, by contrast, the focus is very much on conventional methods in Germany. carbon farming, forest-based CDR, mostly because we've been doing it for a long time, and public acceptance, therefore, is high for that. Germany has a quite ambitious LULUCF target of additional 40 million tons of CO2 to be taken out of the atmosphere by 2045. Unfortunately, Germany's forests have turned a carbon source following years of droughts and bark beetle infestations after 2018. So we've now got an immense gap between these ambitious targets and the forest currently being an immense source in Germany. So they are no longer compensating for the big peatland emissions that we have in Germany, because Germany is #1 worldwide in draining their peatland when it comes to relative areas. Germany has also put notable resources into laying the knowledge base for sustainable CDR portfolios. There's these large publicly funded programs of around 50 million euros over 3 years of a phase 1 of CDR Terra, which is an overarching initiative but focuses foremost on terrestrial CDR, and then its marine partner funding line, CDR Mare. So that's likely going to be prolonged, and so the point there is to really have a comprehensive assessment across. Is this still working?
Yeah, I don't know.
I wonder.
Mic person.
But nobody's complaining. So you hear me in the room.
It's a bit scratchy.
So the main point of these funding measures is to really have a comprehensive assessment. Thanks. To have a comprehensive assessment across ecological, economic, political, societal, ethical considerations of CDR deployment, which also means that many, many disciplines are involved in there. And we now, having been 4 years into that funding, have quite a few interesting results on the table for Germany. So I'm just quickly going to sketch out a few of those. So first, it has been possible to expand the portfolio of methods. So new methods like artificial photosynthesis have been developed, now of course need scaling up. Then very importantly, there have been hurdles on the ground investigated, not so much via demonstrators as in the UK GGR program, but by big stakeholder surveys or systematic evaluations of rules and regulations. And these rules and regulations are abundant in Germany. You may not simply convert a grassland to forest. For agroforestry, your hedge may suddenly become nature protected, and the cost effectiveness is not necessarily given because the common agricultural policy of the EU, although it has improved, still does not deliver sufficient subsidies to incentivize over crop production. So recommendations we give is to really foster multifunctionality of the land and to credit co-benefits. This really seems to be essential beyond CO2 storage, beyond even climate, and these co-benefits for the conventional CDR are big in Germany. We also investigated various scenarios that you could have in terms of CDR for Germany, and we found if you just for conventional CDR, you're running into big compromises if you really want to fulfill the LULUCF targets, so compromises on the economic side or concerning food production. However, there's also some fairly easy entry points. For example, it has been estimated that just by using biogenic residues and waste, you could create around 30 million tons of CO2 removed per year with the existing bioenergy plants. We also found that dialogue is decisive from the micro to the macro level. You need to have that dialogue early on. You need to have it local with those who implement CDR and those who live around it. You need to find the multipliers to really scale it up. But in Germany, we also really had a lot of public dialogue, policy events, museum exhibitions, a lot of education material, which is really picked up well. So there's a lot of hope I put in the next generation. On the international collaboration, I think we should exchange more on the experience we have between UK GGR, CDR Terra and Mare and all the other international programs. There's opportunities for, of course, to collaborate research-wise under the Horizon Europe work programs. I mentioned the international credits that require collaboration for obvious reasons. not least that we have aligned MRV standards. There have been important pushes forward in the EU, of course, with the CRCF. The incentivization and regulatory certainty to facilitate investments is also something that cannot just be done in one country. And I really think that this collaboration is more important than it ever has been, because we need to speed up a sustainable implementation of CDR. And we need to do so despite the atmosphere in climate policy being less ambitious in many parts of the world now than it used to be a few years ago.
Okay, great. We'll come back to some of that international collaboration in a bit when we've heard from everybody. So thanks so much, Julia. Asitava, coming to you in India. Let's hear your perspective, please.
Thank you very much. And you can hear me all?
Yeah.
Great. So let me first talk about what we do. I'm based in Delhi, New Delhi in India, and I lead the Carbon Removal India Alliance, in short CRIA, not CRIA, but CRIA, which is essentially an industry platform for the tech-based novel CDR industry, which is just kind of in the formative stages in India. And we have about 22 members, which is a fair proportion of the small industry that we have in India, which includes, by the way, 3 X Prize finalists and the X Prize winner, Mati Carbon, which ultimately got the X Prize, and 2 other Earth Shot Prize winners. So it's a fairly thriving, I would say, ecosystem that we represent. And we are the only ecosystem organization which is working on policy, on foundational research, on collaboration, and essentially building the ecosystem in a favorable and supportive manner. So while India has net zero target by 2070, removal isn't really part of the big policy picture. The full focus is on mitigation, adaptation, and as far as removal is concerned, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is more of an industrial emission activity, is taking roots. And there is a significant amount of LULUCF and agroforestry and regenerative agriculture and soil carbon, but those are all coming more from agriculture productivity and sustainability point of view. And recently, carbon markets have come into play in support of that. But in support of permanent CDR, while people are supportive, but there has to be more awareness and more specific support that should come in support of durable CDR. But I just wanted to paint a picture of how important CDR is in India and how India can contribute to the CDR overall global objective. Obviously, it's the most populous country, and given its size and given its vulnerability to climate change, whether it's agriculture, urban areas or coastal areas, I think without solving the India removal or climate mitigation problem, we won't be able to solve the global problem. I think that's well understood. And there are certain very strong competitive advantage which India has, primarily in the ag-based CDR space, which is biochar carbon removal and enhanced rock weathering. And I will talk more about that. While other mechanisms like DACs or BECS or ocean alkalization, those are yet to take shape, but I'm sure they also have very strong future potential. So this ag-based CDRs, which is biochar and rock weathering, as I just talked about, is fundamentally based on 120 million smallholder farmers with 160 million hectares of agricultural land and excess unused biomass of the quantity of 180 million tons per year. So these are huge numbers, right? And therefore, the resource availability is not a question mark. The weather conditions or the climatic conditions, which is hot and humid climate, is favorable for some of these methodologies like rock weathering. Also there's a lot of deposit of silicate-based rocks, olivine and basalt in certain parts of the country. And the cost of production, because of various factors, is almost half that would cost in, let's say, Germany or US or North America. I don't know about Australia. So we can do this thing in a fairly high quality at a competitive cost, which is also reflected by all the thriving startups that I just talked about. And the last point is about the co-benefit. I fully agree with some of you that this is has to be a carbon beyond story, even in the Indian context. Particularly, the co-benefits under 4 buckets, if I may call them. The first and foremost, of course, is addressing the climate issue, where removal can complement decarbonization and help India achieve net zero targets quicker and faster than what it would otherwise. And secondly, these applications, because particularly they're going into the soil majority, can also reduce chemical fertilizer and pesticide production, which are both highly emission intensive activities. So indirectly, it can reduce emissions from production of these activities. And the agriculture co-benefit on the soil, we are fairly well aware of how it helps improve yield, retains more water, therefore addresses climate readiness of agriculture, which is very vulnerable to rainfall and weather vagaries. And a lot of byproducts like bio-oil and wood vinegar, which comes out of the biochar production process, can be fairly useful economically to the rural community and improve their livelihood. So that story is clear. Air pollution is the third bucket, because otherwise biomass is openly burnt in many parts of the country to clear agriculture fields between the 2 seasons. Solutions like biochar can actually use biomass rather than burning them in open air and creating air pollution, and be proactively used. And lastly, the economic advantage. Because of this competitive advantage in our assessment, biochar and rock weathering alone can contribute to 0.9 gigawatt per year of removal, which is almost 10 to 20% of the global targets that IPCC sets. With $100 per ton price, this amounts to about a $90 billion industry, which is not a small industry under any stretch of imagination. And obviously, this has a big impact on job creation in the rural area, entrepreneurship, development opportunities, and a significant economic activity in terms of exports, earning, foreign investment, and things like that. So there is a compelling case of CDR in India, and some of the initial current policy developments indirectly are favorable. I think India is the only country where biochar is part of the coming up ETS of India, which is called Carbon Credit Trading Scheme, CCTS, where biochar is one of the approved activities under the offset mechanism. And I'm told that this is perhaps the first CDR integration in any ETS in that sense. Secondly, India and Japan has recently signed India's first Article 6.2 under the Joint Credit Mechanism, JCM, which, although it is a 31st country for Japan, but will be one of the largest and has significant importance going forward in facilitating bilateral trade in carbon. And lastly, just as a anecdotal evidence, one of the states in the hilly regions of India has recently, the state government has invested in a CDR project with a private sector partner, and with an objective, not for carbon removal, but with an objective of avoiding forest fires, which are created by pine needles in that mountainous regions. So they're interested in using the pine needle and other such forest wastes as the input for biochar production. And therefore, this is a good example of how a co-benefit-led development story is more relevant in the India context. And I don't know, Alyssa, whether I have time to talk about my thoughts on bilateral collaboration, or you want me to come back?
We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that in a moment. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's given a great insight, I think, into these different parts of the world that we might not be able to see otherwise. So I want to dive a bit into some of the things that you said. So first of all, there was quite a commonality, and you just picked up on this, Asitava, as well, that each of you actually are approaching in your area CDR from a different angle, right? Either different kinds of co-benefits. In some places, it's okay to talk about CDR for CDR's sake, but in many other places, we have to get on top of that. You really documented really nicely there what the kind of 4 buckets of co-benefits are in an Indian context. I'm interested to hear, in response to the Indian 4 buckets, where you think maybe the number 1 or top 2 kind of framings of CDR are in your part of the world. I don't know, maybe we'll go to Andrew first. It sounds to me like Australia's on an up in terms of talking about climate change. Is it enough to just talk about climate change in terms of CDR, or are you also having to focus on the technologies that deliver the most co-benefits?
Well, we absolutely have to obviously focused on technology advancement. There's no question. One of the things that we are really focusing on that's really resonating in Australia is, of course, we've heard a lot about the opportunities from everyone in the panel around Article 6 and others potentially down the track. So for us, a lot of the dialogue nationally is the question is, how do we build a future novel or CDR industry for Australia? That's a really big framing for us, and that's really resonating, especially at the regional level where we've done our analysis, where people are looking to continue culturally living and sharing their culture in the place that they live, and they want to see a future in those places. So it's really about kind of getting to that level.
Okay, great. So it's about industrial growth. There's an economic bit, but there's also quite a personal jobs and what your local identity is.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's an opportunity here for the next generations, and of course, Australians are incredibly aware of what climate change is doing to us as a nation. So the fact that they can have a future, and that the future will actually be doing something about reducing global levels is such a strong and powerful story that resonates with the younger generations, as I mentioned as well.
Okay, great. So then turning to the US, I mean, I know you were saying it maybe feels a bit mysterious why this government in the US is holding on to CDR, but do you think there's some of this too, the economic growth, the job creation?
I think when it gets to a congressional level and representatives are accountable to voters, yes, people want good, high quality jobs. Many communities do care about climate, and I think there is support. I think the issue is that it's been brought to a highly polarized, liberal coded topic at this national level in the United States. We need to turn down the temperature on that, I think, to actually make progress in a climate frame. But I think there's a lot of ways that we can make this a kitchen table issue without leaning into climate having to be the overarching kitchen table issue.
Yeah, okay, great, that's perfect. Any comments from your side, Julia, on those?
Yeah, so politically it has been accepted now throughout the parties. I think also thanks to the exchange with science, right, that you need the CDR to reach greenhouse gas neutrality, and the German targets with 2045 are ambitious there. Concerning the co-benefits that you targeted here, this is something that isn't implemented yet, but which many think is a big lever in how to really get the public acceptance for it, and also possibly get more economic viability behind some of these methods. And Germany has a similar problem like the UK. It's a super densely settled country. Every square meter is used. If you want to change something, implement something, you better create some co-benefits, either for the farmer or for the people living around it. And we do see these co-benefits very much in terms of biodiversity in particular, but also climate resilience, that these agroforestry systems, for example, could be one way out of the trouble that we have in the agricultural system under continuing heat waves and droughts.
Yeah, perfect. And I think in your answer there, you picked up a little bit on the different stakeholders to whom you're bringing different co-benefits, right? You mentioned farmers in particular there and resilience. Maybe we can step into a bit of a discussion about all of those different stakeholders and engaging with them. Andrew, your camera's off just in case that's you that turned it off. But might not be, okay. Okay, no, that's fine, You're there. You were very briefly just a rock. But it was a very beautiful background there, just so you know your camera's off. Okay, I'm going to go to Asitava for a moment, because when we're thinking about stakeholders, it was interesting that you spoke about the opportunity in India in land and all of those smallholder farmers particularly. Well, that's a lot of people to engage with. That's just one example, I guess, of the different kinds of people you have to bring along with you. I'm interested to hear from you about how that engagement part of CDR works.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And again, let me try to paint a picture briefly about how CDR can progress, ideally. So first of all, other than agriculture, there are other important uses of biochar and rock weathering and other CDR methodologies. Biochar has also application in construction industry, which is not yet fully tapped, for example, or generation of green heat and energy. But I think despite all these potential or rather competitive advantage that I just talked about, the growth is slow, and the primary reason being that the demand side is weak all the carbon removal developers in India are almost fully reliant on exporting relatively high cost removal credits to a very small number of global buyers, which Noah talked about, the AI guys, Microsoft, Google, and Frontier. Three of them together, I believe, constitutes 80% of the global demand, which is, in my opinion, unsustainable. No industry can grow with such a strong, in such a strong buyer's market. So the demand has to be diversified. And one of the stumbling blocks for that demand expansion is the cost of credit. And here is where monetizing the co-benefit, we just talked about the co-benefits, but if we can monetize those co-benefits, let's say if we can sell rock dust or biochar as an agriculture input to smallholder farmers at a price, just like they buy seeds or agrochemical or fertilizers and so on and so forth. And if I can sell biofertilizer enriched with biochar, and that makes a total logical sense in India, where $33 billion goes every year as subsidy for chemical fertilizer, which is not always good for the soil or for sustainability of agriculture. So if, let's say, a certain policy drivers, first of all, recognizes the role of these co-benefits, provide some support and build some, let's say, campaign for farmers to use them, then there'll be far more confidence among smallholder farmers to buy those products rather than hearing it from developers or private sector players, which can actually create an alternative revenue stream for the developers, which can which can bring the cost of removal credit significantly by half or 1/3 or whatever, which is when large Indian corporates will start playing in the CDR scene, either by buying offset credits or being a part of the supply chain itself. Particularly food companies, let's say, using insetting. Why only offsetting? It can be a insetting, given so much of agriculture commodities are used by the H&Ms and Nestle's and GSK's of the world for their food chain. So, in my opinion, this is how the industry will grow in the near future, where government has a big role to play to support both removal and co-benefits. Indian corporates need to be motivated and made aware of the linkages of CDR with their supply chain and net zero strategy. And once we have the supply and demand side more mature, I think the industry will take off on its own, economic cost benefit analysis or whatever case that might come up.
I mean, that was a brilliant roadmap just then. I mean, I think if all of those steps that you described are followed, then you've basically built the Indian market and you've brought everyone with you. So that sounds ideal. Literally ideal. So it would be great if that happens. But what I like is that the way that you told that story of bringing farmers into the story actually worked through commercial value chain, part of which they're already very familiar with, rather than trying to bring them into something new, which I think is really interesting. I wanted to turn to Andrew a moment and then talk about maybe something you touched upon, which is a different group of public, which is the First Nations. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how, in general, about how CDR is seen by the public and how the public is involved in CDR. And then particularly, I think you had some experiences with First Nation communities in particular to share.
Sure, absolutely. And I want to acknowledge that in Australia, we don't have a very mature dialogue at the moment. What we're really seeing for some of our work really is that a deep interest from First Nations in wanting to be part of this, and are certainly looking to Canada and countries like that where there are partnerships that are really developing benefits for communities. Part of this conversation is that we realize, like every conversation with the First Nations, it needs to be a true conversation. It needs to be a dialogue built over time, not just something that appears. So we're trying to start that engagement. We're trying to bring that out. We're trying to also find ways in which we understand also the co-benefits and the important co-benefits that Indigenous communities are seeking. So we're part of that conversation because in some ways, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is seen as a white person problem, if you will. And so for First Nations, there's certainly a bit of there's certainly an understanding of if First Nations lands, sea country lands, country are going to be part of the solution, there needs to be, it can't just be one way. And so it's really important, that dialogue. I don't think we have it right yet, but I'm really excited to be going down that road and also learning from other First Nations around the world, how they've done this. I think that's really comes to global cooperation and sharing that knowledge and understanding what is it going to take to really deliver outcomes that float all boats, that give everybody the outcome we need, but the benefits as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that speaks also to the multidisciplinarity that you were talking about earlier, Julia, as well as kind of the multiple benefits. That's great. Really, really interesting. I wondered if you had anything to say about public dialogue on this topic.
So what I would say from the experience that we had in the Biden administration is nobody has any clue what carbon removal is. It's just like this room does, obviously. But you ask your grandma or your Uber driver, whatever, the chance that you get an answer that situates what carbon removal options are in part of a net zero context and what that means for the Paris Agreement, right? Like, we don't have that. And so I think there's kind of two routes forward. One is to just, I think folks have kind of posited this implicit idea of some sort of carbon removal industrial complex where once it gets started, it creates all these jobs, these co-benefits, people just want more of it. So there's this kind of self-reinforcing cycle. But it has to be motivated by something. And I just don't think we've been able to communicate with the public at all about what net zero actually is, why we should do it. It just shows up as costs to them a lot of the time. And so I think we actually don't have the right infrastructure to have a good public dialogue on this, because carbon removal is not primarily designed to reduce costs for consumers in the way that a cheaper EV would or cheaper solar panels on your roof, right? It's not, that story isn't here. It's about how do you reduce catastrophic risks over the next century of climate change. And thinking in those long-term timeframes is kind of how we're motivated, but it's not how the normal political conversation goes. And so I don't have an answer to that question, more to say that we need to start thinking about how do we start to situate the why and what we're talking about in language that people will actually understand, because thinking about a invisible, odorless, truly ephemeral gas and explaining it as something that is going to harm people in some time frame is really, really hard, but we need to figure out how to make it stick in a way that's relevant today.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, we're asking people to pay for magic to remove something that's invisible out of the air that will hurt them in the future. Not even them, or their grandchildren. Right, yeah, exactly. So it's not the easiest story to tell or to engage with people on. I think there's lots of different routes and lots of different kinds of conversations to be had. We don't have much more time. I'm going to ask a couple of very quick fire questions. The first is about resilience of GGRs. I think this was triggered a little bit by what you said, Julia, as one of your comments, which was that this reversal of the direction of greenhouse gas emissions from removals to emissions in the German forests is perhaps a warning that things may not always continue in the direction that broadly people might expect. There may be some scientists who could foresee that. To what extent do you think we need to be thinking more carefully about resilience in this context?
It's clearly super important. So if the numbers should add up in the end, we need to clearly account for the permanence. We can't do without the non-permanent solutions. That's also clear. And currently we know that 99.9% of all carbon dioxide removal worldwide is due to forests. So we need that. But there's ways to account for non-permanence and for climate risks, although of course it's not ideal. So that needs to be solved. And the easiest answer there is if we are on a low emission pathway, the climate impacts will be lower and these risks will be lower as well. And at the same time, I'm coming back again to this point that some of these CDR options can in fact contribute to a higher climate resilience, like agroforestry, like many carbon farming measures by keeping better soil water conditions, for example, in place. So it's really going nicely hand in hand, but these synergies need to be identified and then really fostered.
Okay, perfect, great, thanks. And now I have a few questions, one for each of you before we finish. So Asitava, you stopped speaking earlier before you were about to tell us all of the great ways that we should use international collaboration to make CDR happen. If you could kind of succinctly tell us a couple of ways you think international collaboration is really important to India in this respect.
Absolutely. I think in the immediate, let's say short term or medium term, collaborating on research and data is an important area. Priya is already started a work with ICAR, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, which is Government of India's own research arm, to do a small field trial of the agriculture co-benefits of biochar and rock weathering measured in Indian conditions. So things like these require, philanthropic funding. So that's one avenue. I think policy plays another role where, let's say, UK is developing its ETS and CDR role in ETS. So why not allow import of removal credits from other countries? Why does the production or the supply has to happen within the domestic country? If you allow imports from global south, that can benefit both UK corporates and government and Indian suppliers. So that's another angle. And I believe essentially sharing good global practices of how different countries are approaching this would also be a good education and awareness building exercise to make the policymakers in India more excited about CDR and understand its role more realistically. So I would say, lastly, I think blended finance, institutions like BII and others can join hands with other development finance institutes to seed some of the pilots, both for insetting and offsetting, with all the co-benefits which are important and relevant before commercial scale operation can become self-sustainable and viable. So I would say these are some of the examples.
Great, excellent. Yeah, some clear ones there. And I mean, things that we touched upon before, obviously, this idea of demand, and you mentioned the industrial demand that maintained in the US, but we spoke earlier about the fact that they're picking off and investing in projects all around the world, but we need to see more of that demand, different blended finance models, and definitely the sharing of information and science. I think it's interesting that you have a program you work on, Julia, that you referred to as the German equivalent of the GGRD program. And so if we have lots of these different programs happening in different countries, sharing more makes a lot of sense. So a question for the final two people, or I'll ask you this as well, Julia, which is a question about how GGR is viewed in your countries. We, in our research here, in the core research, one of the things that we discovered is that people love the term nature. If anything's natural, people will love it. I mean, that's true about food and cosmetics and all kinds of things. But in terms of CDR, it means that anything that's labeled a nature-based solution, people see that very differently than an engineered solution, or the way in which you might talk about categories actually really relates to how people see the technologies and how they're willing to embrace it. So in a very short answer, is there a disparity in your country or region and how people see these technologies? I'll start with Andrew, and then come back into the room here.
A very short answer to that, I think yes. I think there's a disparity at the moment, and I think it's a lack of understanding of the the nuances of the technologies. So the short answer is yes. But picking up on Noah's comment from previously, education levels remain low. So to me, the answer to getting behind that is education, communicating, and let people make decisions on these things rather than just making gut assumptions.
Perfect. Noah?
Yeah, I think it actually begs back to the question on international collaboration, what we need to do here. There's so much that needs to happen on both in order to deliver on climate goals. I think the issue is not necessarily the perception and how we're having a dialogue about nature or tech. I actually see a lot of alignment between the two. It's the macro question of how do we get this whole thing started? And so I think if there were broader global coordination on what is a definition of carbon removal, what should standards for carbon accounting look like, what are reasonable investments from each country to create demand for the different types of solutions, it would look less like people understand nature or tech and have different opinions on that. And I think folks would start to see them more as individual trees as part of a broader forest, which the forest is missing today.
Okay. All right, great. Nice perspective. Julia?
Yeah, so in Germany, there's these split targets between the conventional ones where we do have clear targets and the technological ones. Of course, typically the acceptance is much higher for the conventional ones, but also there's big interest in technological options, German ingenuity, and thinking of creating entirely new methods that may take part of the pain away in emission reduction, where it's very careful that we communicate appropriately that we may not, no matter what new technological options come up. deviate from strong ambitions on the emissions reduction side. However, it should also be made clear it's a continuum, right, from conventional to technological options. BECCS is somewhere in the middle, for example. And we, in the end, it needs to add up, and the portfolio will be changing over time too. So first, it's more the conventional methods we have at the moment, but we need to start working on the technological solutions now such that they're in place 20 years from now. And it's very important to not play one against the other, but to really consider it's a portfolio of options. Without a portfolio thinking, we're going to run into trouble with each individual method pushing towards or beyond sustainable boundaries. And so we need to be really, really open to have that portfolio in place and dynamically change it over time.
Great, perfect. And finally, Asitava, how does that play out in India? We can't hear you anymore. Are you on mute? I can't see that. Oh no, we can't. We still can't hear you.
Muted.
Try again.
Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. I was trying to be too fast on my finger. So yeah, I think what Julia said makes sense in my opinion. First of all, NBS and TechWest are part of the continuum. One has low cost potential of scaling faster, but not permanent, whereas TechWest are more permanent in nature, but it will take time to achieve economy of scale and become mainstream. So I think initially we have to move together, and yeah, I would still come back to the story on co-benefits. In this part of the world, and not just in India, I think in the whole of global South, I think the co-benefit led development story, which is, let's say, also carbon removal, but doing other things as core benefits. I'm not sure whether we should call them co-benefits or core benefits. Perhaps we should call them core benefits, because perhaps in this case, removal is a co-benefit. Then we have a better opportunity and potential for gaining quicker traction.
Perfect, brilliant. That was great. Thank you all for those perspectives, both throughout and for finishing on such a clear and succinct note. Lots of interesting food for thought for everyone in the audience. So thank you so much. Round of applause for the panel.
Well done. Thank you.